Gentlemen, Drew Baye. Give it up.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just going to add to what Doug said, a little bit more nuts and bolts of how to take what he talked about and put it into practice in a workout. Most important aspects of that being the intensity and the volume and frequency of your training. How hard you should be training, how much you should do, and how often. Now, an analogy that I like to use with clients when I'm explaining this, and something that came from Arthur Jones, the guy who invented the Nautilus equipment, is training is a lot like getting a suntan. Exercise is a physical stress. Exposure to very intense sunlight is a physical stress. And any time that you're exposing yourself to a stress for the purpose of trying to get a particular response, you need to consider those three things: the intensity and the volume and the frequency of exposure to that stress. In the case of getting a suntan, if the sunlight is not intense enough, it's not going to stimulate anything in the way of the tan, you could lay out all day on a cloudy day and nothing's going to happen. However, if it is intense enough, up to a point it'll stimulate a tan, but beyond some point, rather than being a stimulus, it's going to start to cause damage. A similar thing exists with exercise. As Doug mentioned earlier, for exercise to be effective, it has to be very, very intense. You have to push yourself as hard as possible during the workout. But if you are training intensely enough for your workout to be effective, there's going to be a limit to how much your body can tolerate. And this limit is a lot less than what a lot of people have come to believe. Now, the third part, frequency, has to do with your body's ability to recover from and then produce the adaptation stimulated by the stress. Now, if you determine through trial and error that you could lay out for about 15 minutes on a clear day, very intense sunlight, and that was about as much as you could tolerate, after that you would burn. Well, you wouldn't do that and then get out of the sun and then go back out 5 minutes later and repeat the process. Because it's not just the volume or the duration of exposure to that stress in a single instance, but the total, the cumulative amount of stress over a period of time that has an effect on your body's ability to recover from and produce the adaptation. Same with the workout. You might do a workout like Doug had discussed, consisting of just a couple heavy multi-joint movements, stimulate the body, leave the gym, but you wouldn't go back an hour later and try and repeat the process. Well, actually shouldn't even go back a day later, or in some cases, a couple days later. The body requires a certain amount of time to completely recover from that before it produces an adaptive response. And if you go back into the gym, you work out again before you've allowed your body that much, enough time to do so, it would be the same as tanning, going inside, coming back out 5 minutes later and trying to repeat the process. Rather than get the results you want, a tan or an increase in muscular strength and size, you end up overwhelming your body's ability to tolerate the stress and produce an adaptive response to it. Now also, and just like getting a suntan, and this is where a lot of the confusion comes from with training, there's a significant amount of variation in how much exercise a person can tolerate and how much recovery time they need between exposure. I've got mostly Western European genetics. My wife is from the Philippines. I can tolerate very little exposure to intense sunlight before I burn, and I can't be out too often. She can be out all day. It doesn't make a difference. She tans very easily. Depending on a person's skin tone, their tolerance and the frequency of exposure that they can handle is going to vary significantly. And a similar situation exists with exercise. Some people can tolerate more, some people can train more frequently, others have very, very little tolerance and require a lot more recovery time between workouts to be able to determine or to be able to completely recover from and produce the adaptation stimulated by exercise. Now, how do you determine what is or isn't appropriate for you in terms of how much and how often? Most importantly, when you're exercising, what you're doing is trying to stimulate a specific adaptive response, an increase in muscular strength. The size just comes along with that. if you're exercising intensely enough that you're stimulating an adaptive response, and if you're not overstressing the body by doing too much, and if you're allowing the body adequate time to recover and produce the adaptation, you should see a measurable increase in strength on a regular basis. If you're not getting stronger, if you're not either able to perform more repetitions or able to use a little bit more resistance, every time you work out, either you're not training intensely enough to stimulate the adaptive response, you're doing too much, you're overwhelming your body's capability to tolerate the stress and adapt to it, or you're training too frequently and not giving your body enough time in between. Now, Doug had mentioned an average of people being around once a week with a pretty significant range, as little as 5 days for some people, up to 10 days or longer for other people. This is kind of middle of the bell curve. You've got some people on the extreme end who can train a little bit more frequently than that. You've got some people who actually require a lot more recovery time. Most people, though, fit right about in that 5 to 10 day time frame. Now, for the average person starting out, most people are not going to train intensely enough at first that they need a lot of recovery. This level of intensity, what Doug is talking about, requires a bit of building up to. There's some resistance to it psychologically, like Doug mentioned, with that panic as you get to approach the really hard part of the exercise. And a lot of people just are not accustomed to or are familiar with how hard they're able to actually push themselves. So I would recommend a person start out on the lower end of frequency, or the lower end of the recovery, about once every 4 or 5 days, about 3 or 4 workouts within a 2-week time frame. And from there, keeping track of their workouts, how much weight they use, how many repetitions they're able to perform on all their exercises, make adjustments. You'll find over time, as your intensity of training increases, that you might start to see a slowdown in progress. If you're somebody that requires, say, 7, 10, or whatever a number of days, when you start to get up to a point where you're training hard enough, you're going to see that you're not making those strength gains on a regular basis anymore. And this would be an indication that, hey, it's time to cut back a little bit, either on the amount you're doing or the frequency over a course of however many workouts you're doing per week. Now, as far as the intensity itself, Doug had mentioned about a lot of people reaching that point where the exercise is beginning to get hard, they start to panic, they hold back. There's a couple reasons that people do this. One, the genetic aspect Doug talked about, just the panic at exerting yourself to the point where you are literally almost incapable of further movement. It is, again, like I said, as far as your body can tell, a life or death event. The only time in the course of normal day-to-day activities when any animal would exert themselves to that degree would be if it was a life or death situation. Your body does not know the difference between you struggling against a heavy barbell on your back doing a squat or fighting off something that's either trying to kill you or that you're trying to kill to eat it. It's natural to get to that point to hesitate, to want to hold back, usually, again, because of the panic Doug talked about, as well as because of, in a lot of people's minds, fear of injury. A lot of people associate training hard with the potential for damaging themselves during the exercise. Now, there's kind of an idea that the harder something is, or the heavier the weight, the more likely you are to damage yourself in the process. But the weight has nothing to do with it. It's not how heavy the weight is, but the manner that you try to lift it that determines whether or not you're going to injure yourself in the process. For example, and getting a little bit off track here, but I'll come back to the intensity. If you were to go out in the parking lot right now and attempt to lift somebody's car or truck, it's not going to happen. It's a much, much heavier weight than anybody's ever going to touch during a workout. But whether you're injured in the process has nothing to do with how much it weighs, but rather the manner in which you attempt to lift it. If you grab the bumper and you just yank at it as hard and fast as you can, you're likely to pull or strain something. On the other hand, if you grab the bumper and you begin to pull gradually,